Federal Drive is presented by GEHA, Government Employees Health Association, proudly providing health and dental benefits to federal employees and their families. Visit GEHA.com.
And now, The Federal Drive with Terry Gerton, sponsored by GEHA.
Welcome to The Federal Drive on Federal News Network. It's Thursday, June 18th. I'm your host, Terry Gerton, and I'm glad you're here. Coming up on this hour of The Federal Drive, it's one thing to expand missile production capacity. It's another to rebuild stockpiles fast enough to meet actual demand. Plus, for DHS contractors, the funding may be back, but turning that into actual work and payment is another story. These stories and much more ahead during this hour of The Federal Drive. We begin with this. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention is battling one of the worst Ebola outbreaks on record, calling on its workforce to help contain its spread overseas. But the CDC is dealing with last year's staffing cuts and still lacks permanent leadership in many of its roles. Further, internal surveys show employees responding to the outbreak are also dealing with low morale. Federal News Network's Jory Heckman is joining me with more details. Jory, thanks for being here.
Hey, Terry, great to be here.
First of all, tell us what CDC is really doing in response to the Ebola outbreak.
CDC, across its nearly 24 centers, they are doing a full court press to address Ebola. This is, of course, happening overseas, largely in the Democratic Republic of Congo as well as Uganda. But this is an overseas effort, and they're trying to keep it that way. They're trying to keep the spread of Ebola from coming overseas to the United States. And so this response is looking both domestically and internationally. The CDC has employees set up at airports across the country trying to screen passengers, ensure that this isn't something that is an issue. And overseas, it is working with the ministries of health of other countries to contain the outbreak and make sure there's an on-the-ground response.
Do you have a sense of how many employees are actually engaged in the Ebola response?
What I had heard from at least one of the centers here that's primarily in charge of this, the National Center for Emerging and Zoonotic Infectious Diseases, doesn't exactly roll off the tongue here, but they are one of the centers primarily involved in response. What I had heard from, based on an internal recording that I received a couple of weeks ago, they had somewhere in the neighborhood of 200 employees actively involved in that response, and they're calling on more employees to raise their hands, to volunteer, to do more of the airport screening.
Working on Ebola, it's got to be a little nerve-wracking, very much a life or death scenario. How is that fitting in with all of the changes that happened at CDC over the last 12 to 18 months?
Well, CDC, much like the broader Department of Health and Human Services, has gone through major staffing cuts. What we saw with HHS more broadly is that they saw about 20,000 employees leave last year. That was a combination of layoffs and voluntary separation incentives. What we've seen at the CDC is that they've seen more than a quarter of their staff leave since the end of fiscal 2024, roughly aligns with what we've seen happen under the Trump administration so far. And so what we've seen, based on what I've seen from CDC staff and internal polling that employees have shared with me, job security and fear of additional layoffs were top concerns for this survey that they shared with me, which showed that about half of the NCEZID staff either rated morale as low or very low, and only 4% of staff said that morale was very high.
So when you're asking a reduced workforce to volunteer for potentially deadly duty, that seems like a real challenge for their leadership.
Yeah, this is a huge stepping up of the work that they're being asked to do, and you're seeing fewer employees on the job to do that work. And, there's also been some other drivers of low morale at CDC. They've been the agency amongst many other agencies that have been really restrictive for telework as a reasonable accommodation. That's been one thing. And something else we recently discussed, Terry, is that the CDC's annual performance bonus evaluations have been going on. And what we had learned is that CDC was going to rein in some of its bonuses for its top performers. They were originally slated to get a 4% bonus if they were getting fives, top scores on their performance evaluations. what we had learned is that they were then on track to get something close to half of that original amount. So certainly not going to help morale in that regard either.
Jory, you're describing a really tough work environment, and it seems like it's complicated by missing a lot of permanent leadership at CDC. How is that playing out?
Well, just to take a look at things here, there is no permanent CDC director. The permanent NIH director, Dr. Jay Bhattacharya, is working double duty here. He is the acting CDC director, but not even the CDC acting director. He has exceeded that formal designation under the Federal Vacancies Reform Act. He is now kind of the interim leader of CDC, but it's that legalese of performing the duties of is kind of his formal title at CDC. But there's also no permanent director of the Food and Drug Administration. There's no permanent Surgeon General. And what we've learned is that over 80% of CDC center directors are being led by acting officials. That's raised some concerns with some former CDC officials saying that this is not the kind of scenario you want when CDC is being asked to do more and step up.
Jory, Ebola is certainly the big headline, but CDC is dealing with all kinds of other outbreaks. We have domestic measles outbreaks. We have hantavirus that was in the headlines just a few weeks ago. How are they trying to respond more systematically to these various challenges?
Well, on the same call, I did hear from the people who are leading the hantavirus response, and they actually said, job well done. We've done a pretty good job of containing this. And that by and large, the mission is going well in that regard. And so that was one example of CDC internally saying job well done. The staff is stepping up to address hantavirus, but there's other things going on as well. Of course, CDC is working with the Agriculture Department for the return of screwworms in this country, and that's a big concern for cattle and livestock more broadly. So that's yet another big project that CDC is being asked to do, in addition to everything that you just described.
Do they have any hiring plans to try to rebuild the workforce?
They do, although it's very interesting to see how that's played out. HHS Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr. has told lawmakers that HHS is broadly going on a pretty significant hiring surge, that they have the authority to hire about 12,000 employees across HHS. This would actually bring the HHS workforce to higher levels than it saw before the Trump administration. But for CDC, they've been given the authority to hire somewhere in the neighborhood of 900 positions. What I've heard from many CDC employees, and I have spoken to quite a number of them, they say that that's not really translating to hires on the ground, that they are just not seeing that hiring materialize just yet, and they have yet to get the official go-ahead from HHS to carry out those hires.
So we've got low staff, low morale, really challenging world environment that these folks are having to respond to. What's your sense of what's next?
Well, I think one thing to keep an eye on is if and when CDC gets the approval to do this hiring, if it makes hundreds of hires as it's allowed to do on paper, and what that hiring looks like, and whether it gives relief to these employees who do feel that they've been stretched thin. This has been an agency that is being asked to do more with less, and we're seeing some of the strain here.
That's Federal News Network's Jory Heckman. Jory, thanks for keeping us up to date.
Thanks, Terry.
You can find his story at federalnewsnetwork.com. Up next, it's one thing to expand missile production capacity. It's another to rebuild stockpiles fast enough to meet actual demand. This is the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network.
Tune in Tuesdays at 10:30 a.m. and 2:30 p.m. for the Innovation in Government Show, sponsored by Carasoft. Hear from the industry leaders advancing the technologies shaping how agencies modernize, secure operations, and deliver better services. Innovation in Government covers what is changing now, what is working from cybersecurity and cloud to data, AI, and emerging technologies. Listen to Innovation in Government, Tuesdays at 10:30 a.m. and 2:30 p.m. on Federal News Network. Search Innovation in Government.
Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Even with increased funding and production, rebuilding key missile stockpiles could take years, creating a gap between current demand and available supply. We get a closer look now from Mark Kansian, Senior Advisor with the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Mark, it is great to have you on the show. Thanks so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me on the program.
We have been covering the strain in the missile industrial base for a while here, some with CSIS's own analysis, some talking to the primes themselves. But your latest analysis puts a timeline on rebuilding specific inventories. As you did this research, what was the most surprising or concerning thing you found in those timelines?
The timelines stretch from 1 to 4 or 5 years, and they vary depending on the munition. There are some that will be replenished relatively quickly, like JASSM, because we've been buying some steadily for the last number of years. But some will take 4 or 5 years, like Tomahawk and Patriot, because we have not been buying large numbers, and there's a lot of competition for the output.
Your paper makes the point that this really isn't a money problem, that there is plenty of money between the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, the 2026 defense appropriations, what's planned for 2027. There's plenty of money, but it really is a construction and capacity constraint. What is it about some of these more in-demand missiles that is going to require so much time?
The problem is that in the past, munitions had a hard time competing. After the Cold War, we expected to fight regional conflicts that would be short, so we didn't see a need for large inventories. We structured the defense industrial base for efficient production at peacetime production levels. And then munitions never competed very effectively because the services would rather build platforms, which were going to be visible for 30 years, rather than munitions that would go into a storage bunker. So coming into the current period, we did not have large stockpiles. That thinking began to change with the war in Ukraine, where we saw that many inventories were exhausted supporting Ukraine. And then we've seen it again here with Iran. Now we're putting the money against those capabilities, but it just takes time to increase production capacity and for these missiles to be produced.
Some of that capacity constraint comes from the supply chains. I mean, some of these missiles remind me of the old jokes about F-35s, that they had suppliers in all 50 states. And some of these missiles are the same. How do you expand such a complicated supply chain so quickly?
Well, the short answer is you can't. It takes time. It takes years. The primes want commitment from the Department of Defense. Show me the money. They don't want to build facilities that aren't going to be used, and getting that whole process going, from appropriation to the contract, then starting to build the capacity, that just takes time. Now, we've seen increases in production capability. Looking at Patriot, for example, we've gone from about 150 a year to 300 to 600, of which the U.S. gets about half. So there has been progress, but it takes time, years.
Is this just a matter of going from an 8-hour production day to 24/7 production and trying to hire enough people to man the facility?
Some of it is expanding with existing facilities, but some of it requires building new facilities. We're seeing that. Also, to get up to the really high production levels, you have to add facilities. And again, that takes time.
When you look at the variability across weapon systems, the recovery timelines are very different, as you said at the beginning, some within 12 months, some 4 or 5 years. How does that uneven recovery then shape military planning for future operations?
Well, it puts pressure on planning in the Indo-Pacific. We have enough munitions to continue any conflict in the Middle East if, for example, fighting were to start again against Iran. Although we've used maybe half of the inventory of 4 of the 7 munitions we looked at, we still have half of it left. The problem is that every missile you use is one less that's available both for allies and partners and for a conflict in the Western Pacific. Most analysts thought that we did not have enough munitions even going into this conflict, and now we have half of those inventories left. So we have this gap, this window of vulnerability in the Western Pacific.
I'm speaking with Mark Cancian, retired Marine Colonel and Senior Advisor with CSIS International Security Program. Mark, let's pull on the Indo-Pacific piece a little bit longer because there has been conversation about, does this mean that China sees a window of opportunity here to pursue some of perhaps their geopolitical goals? What's your sense?
Well, there's no question that from a warfighting perspective, the U.S. is in this window of vulnerability where we don't have as many of the preferred munitions. We're not going to run out of munitions, but when we run out of the long-range munitions, then we have to use medium or short-range munitions. That increases platform vulnerability. We have much more losses and therefore much more risk. But we also have to consider two other things that are coming out of this war that affect the Indo-Pacific. One of them is the demonstrated skill of U.S. military forces. Putting aside the political aspects of the conflict, there's no question that the U.S. has been able to exert air superiority over Iran, do that relatively quickly and easily. Our missile defense capabilities have been pretty good. And we've demonstrated these capabilities also against Venezuela and against the Houthis. So the Chinese are looking at this and wondering whether the U.S. might be a more formidable adversary than they had thought. They're very aware that their last combat experience was in 1979 against Vietnam, and they did very poorly. The other thing is that the Iranians have been able to do in the Strait what the Ukrainians have done in the Black Sea, and that is, without a conventional navy, exert presence and exert control. And the Chinese must be looking at the Strait of Taiwan and wondering whether the Taiwanese might be able to do that, particularly with the ramp up of procurement that they have begun.
So that brings us back to stockpiles and capacity, I think. And you talked about how much of the current production goes to domestic use versus going to allied sales. When you think forward, do you continue to see that as a 50-50 split? What does this mean for what our allies can expect?
Well, it's going to be a matter of contention with allies for the next several years. Looking at Patriot, for example, about half the production has been going to allies and partners, but there'll be a lot of pressure to put the United States at the front of the line. But that means that other countries like the Gulf states, who have exhausted their inventories, like the Ukrainians, who desperately need Patriots, will not be getting theirs. There are 18 countries that use Patriot, and there'll be competition among them to get the output. We're seeing the same thing with Tomahawk, for example. The Japanese have ordered 400. They've been told that they may have to wait on that, but they see this as a key capability for their abilities to deter China and to exert more control over their territory. So we're going to see continuing tension.
Now put yourself in the seat of one of the prime contractors for these missile systems. You've got international demand that continues to grow. You've got at least temporary increase in U.S. demand. What do you need to see as a global supplier to make you think that it's worth making your own capacity investments for the long term?
I'll want to see long-term financial commitments from the department, and we've seen some with multi-year procurements, but I would want to see more of that, and I would encourage Congress to support these multi-years, because the problem for defense industry is quite understandable. They don't want to build facilities and then find out 2 years from now that the contracts dry up because the conflicts have ended, and that now they're seen as being wasteful when they were trying to meet the demand. So it's a case of show me the money.
Is it also reflective of a fundamental change in our military philosophy? You kind of mentioned 20 years ago we decided we weren't going to fight these kinds of wars anymore. Does it seem like the tables have turned a bit?
Absolutely. There's much more sensitivity, much more awareness of what a protracted conflict might need, as opposed to a short-term regional conflict. We saw that with Ukraine, mostly with ground forces, and now we're seeing it with Iran, more with air and naval forces.
And as we think more about autonomous systems, the drone wars in Ukraine and other places, Do you think that those will replace missile systems, or will the missile systems always now have a key role in future U.S. military operations?
This is rapidly evolving part of warfare. So far, what we're seeing is both high and low end missile systems. If you look at what the Russians have done and what the U.S. has done, there are high end ballistic missiles that are much more likely to get to their targets. Then there are the Shahed kind of drones that are fired in vast numbers, most of which get shot down, a few of which get through. And I think we're going to see that kind of dynamic in the future. But that's very different for the United States, which has typically had a all high-end approach.
Retired Marine Colonel Mark Cancian is Senior Advisor with the CSIS International Security Program. Mark, thank you so much for joining me, for walking us through this analysis.
Thanks again for having me on the program.
We'll post this interview and a link to the paper at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts. Still to come, the Pentagon is spending billions on major weapon systems, but there are growing questions about whether they match the way conflicts are actually unfolding today. But first, for DHS contractors, the funding may be back, but turning that into actual work and payment is another story. You're listening to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Even with new money in place, DHS contractors are still dealing with delays, restart friction, and gaps left by the shutdown, showing just how long it can take for funding to translate into real execution. Here to walk us through how the department is responding is CEO of the Professional Services Council, Jim Carroll. Jim, it's great to have you back. Thanks for being here.
Thank you, Terry. It's always wonderful to be with you.
Well, resources are always top of mind when you and I talk. The Senate NDAA language has just dropped recently. Do you have any hot takes for us on that?
Boy, what a week it's been, right? Terry, I have to say, I think I'm looking forward to, and I know you are, and I know our listeners are, when the summer recess actually comes, I think we'll all be able to take a breath. The NDAA Senate language was released this week. Obviously, there's a lot in there, and I think we'll certainly be wearing out some shoe leather going back and forth to Capitol Hill with some of these provisions. Some of them, we think we'll be very supportive of, and some I think, might need some tweaking, as we like to say. And so I think it'll be a busy few weeks before it actually gets to the floor. And Terry, as you know, we're still sort of waiting for a lot of the House language to come in, and then we'll have a better sense of what's going on.
Well, as you're pondering that important legislation, let's talk a little bit about the Department of Homeland Security. We've been following the funding travails there, and they finally got their appropriations. But it wasn't easy, and it caused a lot of disruption for the contractors who work in that sector. What are you hearing now that the appropriations bill has been signed?
Again, Terry, I have to say, that sentence of "it's been a busy time," I think like we've been saying that, for the last year and a half, and certainly as it relates, especially to DHS. So I was over at DHS last week and had some meetings there about contractors and what they're doing. Actually had the chance just to say hi and real quickly to the secretary himself. And Terry, you know how you always love gossip news. Do you want some inside gossipy news about Secretary Markwayne Mullins?
Oh, spill the tea. Go ahead.
Okay, this is secret. Don't tell anyone that I am the one spilling the tea on this. But it was, as you all recall, like 100 degrees. It was a Friday afternoon, and the secretary did not have a tie on. And he said that he kept his rule from the Hill that if it's over 100 degrees and it's a Friday, he does not like to wear a tie. So they're breaking news. I don't know how you want to release that, but that's some good gossip right there.
Well, Jim, thanks for keeping us up to date on that. But where's the secretary on his $100,000 contract review rule?
Yeah, we did. The rest of our meetings at DHS went well. They very much, I think they are relieved, quite frankly. The people with whom we met, they know this created burdens not only for them, but for contractors. And so the lifting of that, we're very pleased that they understood that creates real concerns. And now with a reconciliation bill, the contractor community really does need DHS to step up and start delivering. The companies that do work for DHS have really been under enormous financial strain, and with the reconciliation bill, hopefully we'll get the contractors reimbursed for the work that they've already done, and they have already paid their employees. And so we're very optimistic about that. And the contractors need that, Terry. It's like any business. You can't operate under day-to-day concerns. You need some stability. And in the conversations we had with the business workforce and the very, very brief conversation with the secretary, they understand that the companies that perform work for the country through DHS are really an integral part. Terry, as we saw, the Homeland Security encompasses so much. At the beginning of the week, remember, we saw the news about a disruption of possible attack in DC at the fight that took place. Our contractors are sitting side by side in the Intel and DHS bus, analyzing information, going through information. And so, these are the programs that could have been impacted if the contractors were not able to perform. And so whether it's airport security, disaster preparedness as we're coming into hurricane season, these are what our contractors want to perform for the American taxpayer. And so we're very happy that DHS is lifted the $100,000 rule and committed to working with our companies. And like I said, just the mere fact that they wanted meetings with us is a really good sign.
Jim Carroll is the executive director of the Professional Services Council. Jim, this latest funding bill for DHS, though, really only solves the problem for CBP and ICE. It's multi-year funding there, but the rest of DHS is going to have to go through the regular appropriations process in just a few more months. Are you sensing in any way that contractors are getting cautious about committing to work with DHS given the uncertainty of their funding?
I think that, boy, the fact that you say just a couple of months, really, it sort of bursts the bubble there, Terry, of what just happened with reconciliation. But that topic did come up naturally, that this is a stopgap until we get to later this fall. I think the hope is the capital P political issues that prevented some of this from going forward, that with the reconciliation, with some of the willingness to make political changes, that there will be some success in actually getting this encompassed with all of the other departments that need funding, that there won't be another breakout just for DHS. And the companies are aware within DHS that perform that work that there's never certainty, and there never is in life, right? Except, death and taxes are the only two things we can ever count on. And so I think we're all feeling optimistic. I think the secretary very much understands this, and some of the other people understand this. And so someone's going to win the FIFA tournament, and sometime DHS is going to get funded. And so that's what we're going to operate under.
All right, we'll join you in the optimism there and keep our fingers crossed. But let's change the topic for just a minute. The Foreign Ownership Control or Interest, FOCI rule. It used to be something only cleared contractors worried about, but there's a new version of it. Tell us what you're watching there.
Yeah, what we're seeing is that the Trump administration is planning to review, rewrite, amend the FOCI rule, and what Congress really intends to do with this and how they want to implement it. The concern is that these regulations will put an undue burden on small businesses that can contract with the federal government. And we certainly understand and appreciate the value of national security, but defense contractors do a lot of work for not only the U.S., but a lot do, the small companies also do work. In fact, one out of every 4 contractors for the Department of War goes to a small business, and small businesses make up 70% of the defense industrial base. And so the way that this is implemented, the FOCI rule, there is a concern that I have about small businesses being unfairly impacted on this. And there's already been a decline in the last few years of some of the small companies where a lot of good people work and do wonderful things. And so I think that we'll see what happens. Congress, as you know, took this up earlier. They had hearings on this. We expect more hearings, sort of across the board, but on this issue as well. And so that is one of those issues that representing our small businesses, making sure that their concerns are heard. And so, like I said, Terry, we're wearing out our shoe leather, working Capitol Hill to make sure that everyone understands the impact of what they're doing as we try to support the effort, making sure that no one is unfairly impacted by it. And, at PSC, we're constantly, working with the administration or the Hill to sort of talk about, the issues that matter the most. With 400 companies, the leading trade association for this issue, for government contractors, so many issues from small to large come up and are important to our members.
So, Jim, on this FOCI rule, are you sensing that there's still room for negotiation, or is this something that folks just need to prepare for?
I'm always hopeful. Come on, Terry. There's always room for negotiation. Never say quit. We're absolutely, still engaged in conversations up there, and we'll look forward to seeing if there are any space for making a few tweaks to level the playing field. And so, no, I'm always optimistic. That's why we're in DC, right?
Well, you've got a conference coming up where you guys can share this kind of information, right?
Absolutely. Our acquisition conference is coming up in just a week on June 25th. And so we're very excited. We have a great lineup of speakers for that. And we've just really been bringing our members to meetings. And whether it's the acquisition conference, where our members can have direct engagement with government leaders, decision makers. We've been doing small business meetings as well. I think we've now met with everyone but one of the undersecretaries at the Department of War. That one's being scheduled. We're now having requests coming back from the Department of War for more meetings. The Department of Energy is interested in doing a reverse industry day with our members. And so we're going to have a very busy summer. And like I said, Terry, maybe August is coming, but it seems like a long way off.
Jim Carroll is the Executive Director of the Professional Services Council. Jim, it's always great to talk with you.
Thank you, Terry.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts. Coming up next, the Pentagon is spending billions on major weapon systems, but there are growing questions about whether they match the way conflicts are actually unfolding today. This is the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Even as defense spending rises, many investments are still going into high-cost, limited-use systems, raising questions about whether the U.S. is building the right mix to sustain a prolonged fight. Here to share her analysis is Senior Defense Policy Analyst for the Center for Defense Information at the Project on Government Oversight, Virginia Berger. Virginia, welcome back to the show. It's great to see you.
It's great to see you as well, Terry.
You have an interesting new paper out, Exquisite Defense Fails in Practice. Let's start at the top. Define for me what you mean when you say exquisite defense.
So exquisite is a term that has been used as a label for specific systems and munitions within the U.S. military for a couple decades now. Initially, it was used as a sort of term by the establishment, by the leadership within the Pentagon as a critique of our procurement habits that were left over from the Cold War, right? Like looking into the patterns we had built on obtaining and procuring incredibly technologically dense and complex missiles that came out of needs identified during the Cold War while we were, playing nuclear brinksmanship with the Soviets, and all of the sort of patterns and trends that were established in military procurement and acquisition during that period. And so in the mid-2000s, there was sort of this retrospective going on saying, okay, are those, exquisite systems, these incredibly technically complex, incredibly expensive systems, going to be what we need in the next fight? And this question was first raised by the military establishment. not much was done within the Pentagon to address it. There were a couple initiatives, but no real credible action was taken at a scale that, any civilian would be able to notice. But it became sort of a pejorative term within military policy spaces overall. And exquisite defense turned into this term of critique, saying, hey, when we buy exquisite things, we are buying things that are too expensive, too fancy. The phrase that always is sort of used in tandem with exquisite is high cost, low density, right? Incredibly expensive, but not very many, right? If you look at the average cost for something like some of these munitions that are often labeled as exquisite, one of them costs $15 million for a single bomb, right? And that's exquisite. It's these huge high costs because of how technically dense they are, all of the process that has to go into developing and making them. That's what that's what we're referring to when we say exquisite.
I really appreciate that articulation of the concept, because the paper focuses on two particular systems, air defense systems, Patriot and THAAD. Both have been in the military inventory for decades now. You tried to make the argument that this recent Operation Epic Fury, is the first time we've really tried to use them at any scale, and we didn't get what we paid for.
Exactly. I make this point that exquisite defense is something worth critiquing, especially given how Epic Fury has shown us that the Iranian strategy of throwing cheap drones, namely their Shahed drones, at us is actually very effective. And I think we were met with a little more pushback from them than maybe we anticipated with the might of the U.S. military. And so if you look at these two systems, which are the ones I pulled out specifically for their performance in Epic Fury, right, the Patriot system and the THAAD, they have a long history of promises and some performance, but never against a near-peer adversary like Iran. And so the reason I picked them was because they were sort of this perfect encapsulated example within Epic Fury to serve as a wider critique of our exquisite systems and our penchant for procuring exquisite systems within the U.S. military.
Where do you see the biggest gap between what they cost and what they actually deliver?
So when you look at their cost versus delivery, the cost, you really have to look back over history, right? The Patriot system was first developed in the 70s. We've had it for an extensive amount of time. So if you look at life cycle cost, it's almost impossible to truly conceive of it based on how expensive it is. But if you look at their individual munitions today, like the PAC-3 MSE, that's the interceptor missile that is fired out of the Patriot systems today, a single one of those is millions of dollars. And that's just one shot. That's not even accounting for the maintenance and upkeep of the system, the cost of the radars associated with it, right? It's not even encompassing that. So just baseline to fire one of those at one drone is an immense cost. THAAD, similarly, their missiles are just as expensive, if not more so. And we look at the cost of their radars. There's been estimates, one of the radars of a THAAD system in Epic Fury was taken out, and to rebuild and reconstitute that THAAD system, I've seen some people estimating the sort of untold cost is going to be over $1 billion. And that's just for one of these systems. And so if you look at the cost, it's immense. But then you look at performance, you have to realize that these two systems have been touted by the defense industry, by their manufacturers, as the cutting edge of air defense, right? Capable of handling every air threat in today's modern environment. I'm paraphrasing one of the phrases that one of the defense companies sort of throws on in their press release every time they get a new contract for these. And the reality is they were never designed to actually handle the full spectrum of air threats. We go back to the Patriot system, which again was first developed in the 70s. It was meant to target aircraft, not missiles. In fact, it was a software update in the Gulf War that made it able to target missiles, because they took it to the Gulf War and were like, oh no, the missile threat is what's really the problem from the Iraqis, not aircraft. That's what we need to handle. And so they used a software update to make it be able to attack missiles, which was never its intended purpose. And so you sort of see all these built-on additions that have brought it to today. Same with the THAAD. The THAAD system, both of them only detect within a very specific altitude range for airborne threats, munitions, aircraft. The THAAD system in its initial development in the late 90s, early 2000s, they were actually struggling to detect within the full altitude spectrum that they were initially promising, and they actually shrank it. So they now only detect at very, very high altitudes where the drones aren't. And so they can't even detect drones. And in fact, we've seen prior to Epic Fury incidents in the Middle East where either U.S. forces or allies who had purchased these same systems for us flagged, hey, they didn't detect that drone, and it got through and made a hit. So we knew that before going into Epic Fury, and yet we still had these systems as the backbone of our air defense. And we saw them in one situation, a THAAD radar was taken out successfully, bringing that whole system offline. And these things have a massive range. So what else was then left at risk once that was offline? What other equipment, what other, service members, allies were then put at risk because of that? Same thing with the Patriot, right? Like one part of it, one radar is taken out, suddenly it can't fire, it can't detect without that. This billion-dollar system is now offline. Or if you look at the cost of, back to specifically the munitions, the defensive interceptor missiles, we fire one or two of those off to take out one drone. That's millions of dollars to take out a $20,000 drone. Oh, but wait, that drone is part of a swarm that has 80 more. And so how many millions of dollars are we then firing? And so you have to look at those promises, what they were originally designed for, with the actual current threat picture and what that cost truly has amounted to.
Virginia Berger is Senior Defense Policy Analyst for the Center for Defense Information at the Project on Government Oversight. Virginia, we're at an interesting potential decision point here. The estimates are that the current operation has drawn down about 50% of the inventory of these kinds of missiles. Something will have to be bought to replace them. The current 2027 defense budget looks like it's trying to force a lot of money down the throat of missile providers to try to bring more missiles into inventory faster. Would you say that we're maybe missing the boat here a little bit? Should we be buying something else?
I think we should be. And there certainly are indications and warnings that the military is looking for cheaper options, right? There was a call put out by the Army a few weeks ago soliciting input from defense manufacturers for low-cost munitions. They plan to have, an event where they will be able to come and display them and pitch them to the Army, and the Army is the largest branch, so presumably if they like it, it will then be procured across several other branches as well. So there's efforts being made, and there are discussions about lower cost munitions, right? We have made our own variant of the Shaheed. We got one and reverse engineered it, and we now have one called the Lucas drone, though it is not a program of record. It is not being procured at scale yet, but that is something that we are working with and experimenting on. So the efforts are there. But we are still procuring and still spending money on these incredibly exquisite systems. And I think what Congress needs to look at as they are considering this year's budget and they are going through it, both in the Armed Service Committees and appropriations, is, are we getting our bang for our buck here? And is this worth pouring all of this money in? I'm not going to make that decision for them. I am not an elected member of Congress. But if they ask me my opinion, I would say you need to be more critical and you need to take a look at what these systems do in the strategies required for modern war. What did Epic Fury teach us, and how can we bring that back and consider it more fully? Because if we look at the cost that they are putting in with these new framework agreements, with the defense contractors that have come out since Epic Fury, yes, they're trying to pour more money into this and saying, oh, we're going to make these stockpiles back faster and we're going to be able to get these back. That is a fun headline, but the reality is it's going to take 2 to 7 years to fully replenish the stockpiles, right? Like that's 2 for the ones that are fastest to manufacture, 7 for the truly exquisite, complex ones that take an immense amount of manufacturing effort and technology to create, right? And so we see these things, but the reality is it's not going to be faster tomorrow. It's going to be faster in 7 years. And then what is the cost at that point, right? Because then you get into the entire discussion of deterrence, and if our adversaries know we don't have a stockpile, and was this worth it? And those are all incredibly important conversations, but fundamentally we need to pay attention to the headlines that say, oh, it's fine, we're just going to build more and we're going to build them faster. Well, at what cost? building these technically advanced, exquisite munitions is going to be expensive. And are we, in 7 years, once we've just replenished all of them, going to be in the same boat that we are now, where our adversaries have tailor-made a strategy to combat us with much cheaper, much more cost-effective munitions?
This seems like a classic situation that we often hear about, which is the defense acquisition program is just not nimble enough to make a sudden change based on real-time information. We've had these programs for decades. We've been buying these programs for decades. We keep putting money into these programs for decades into the future. How would you like to see that process shift so that the Defense Department has more real-time flexibility to shift its focus in acquisition?
I think we've seen some efforts over the last 18 months to try and do that. But I would actually counter and say that I want them not necessarily to reform their entire process, but to actually use the information that is being generated by their own department just outside of the defense acquisition program, right? We had evidence that the Patriot and THAAD systems were not appropriate for modern war. We knew that they couldn't detect low-flying munitions and low-flying drones. That was already evident from incidents the year prior and before that. And in fact, if you look at the Department of Testing and Evaluation, who continue to run tests on these systems, we had multiple annual reports starting from 2019 that showed, hey, we haven't been testing these. And this is the department itself saying we have not been testing these in a realistic combat scenario. We have not actually been able to test them and make sure that they could perform at the level necessary given what we expect our adversaries to throw at us in modern combat. So I would say, yes, we should probably make some reforms so that we can move with the speed of innovation that modern combat requires. But at the same time, we had this information. And if there was just a better, more holistic approach to encompassing all of this data that we already have in reforming what we do when we decide to continue procuring the systems, we may not have been in this situation, and we may have identified that, hey, maybe we don't need to sunset these entirely, but maybe we don't need to spend as much money on them, and maybe we divert some of that to air defense and munitions that would be more cost-effective and appropriate given the threat that we are likely going to face. We had that information, and they could have performed on it.
Virginia Berger is Senior Defense Policy Analyst for the Center for Defense Information at the Project on Government Oversight. Virginia, thanks so much for sharing your insights with us today.
Of course, Terry.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts. The Federal Drive with Terry Gerton is produced by Eric White and Michelle Sandiford. Our web editor is Stephanie Wright. For the latest updates, stay with federalnewsnetwork.com or follow us on Facebook, YouTube, and LinkedIn. Up next, the top national headlines from ABC News and the Federal Newscast. I'm Terry Gerton. Thanks for listening.